our culture in the US is really devaluing of exploration. It's very linear, it's solve a problem, it's, be direct, whereas a lot of cultures have held on to the belief that indirect can be more powerful. That allowing yourself to sit in ambiguity and uncertainty and metaphor, that's where healing is. We struggle with that a little bit more in our culture.
Marshall Lyles, welcome back to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rodham. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and by the way, welcome for you got the EMDR Advocacy Award from EMDRIA and the last EMDRIA conference. So congratulations on that too.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Marshall, today we're talking about the integration of EMDR and Sandtray. So for those of us who are Sandtray naive, if you will, we all know what EMDR is and how to use it. Can you tell us, kind of give us a little background about Sandtray? What is it? And what are the benefits of using this kind of different type of therapy?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of times when especially Western therapists start to describe a modality or a method, they like to believe that it was created once the professional version of therapy was established as a career. But, in all actuality, the use of sand and imagery and narrative has been used by healers for hundreds of years. Almost every culture has some version of working with that, including, here in the US, a lot of Native American tribes, did sand story and sand healing work. But when you move into, the reality of once therapy was organized as a profession, Margaret Lowenfeld in London established a set of procedures and methodology for organizing how clients could place miniature figures into a tray of sand to represent their inner world, with the idea being, especially starting with children, but then it moved up to being applicable to all ages, the idea being not everyone has access to the same level of verbalization for narrating what's happening in their inner world. And so giving movement and sensation and image an opportunity to speak for those parts of self allowed everyone to participate in healing. And then, of course, it started to be understood that that's not just about developmental ability. It also has to do with, traumatic exposure, that not all of those traumatically held networks have ease of access to verbal expression. And so it's become a very popular choice for trauma clinicians in the expressive world as a way of making sure people get to feel witnessed, all parts of themselves.
Yeah, so the way you describe it sounds like a right brain kind of therapy, right? Accessing the nonverbal. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely has many elements. Then there is an invitation for words to be added and story to come. And so, without overselling the amount of science we actually, understand, there is kind of a bilateral mode that happens with Sandtray, because you're using the sensation of the sand, and then you're, using some prompts and some words, and then you're going into looking at the imagery created, and then you're giving it story, and it's back and forth the whole time. So it does make it a particularly effective integration with the EMDR, because I think it's already supporting so many of the mechanisms that work for EMDR.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. It's interesting how you describe that. Healers have used sand for generations, and kind of reminds me of what people are saying about EMDR, or by the use of bilateral stimulation with drumming and movement, and there's a lot of bilateral. So can you talk a little more in detail about the bilateral aspect of Sandtray?
Sure. If a client comes in to a sand office, the first thing that they see, other than some trays of sand, are all of these figures, right, that are back here. And it does. I am in a training center, here. So individual offices don't necessarily have this many figures, but even from the moment someone walks into a sand office, the metaphors, the colors, the textures are right there waiting for everyone. So there's some right hemisphere activation from the very beginning, which we know goes a long way to facilitating an experience of safety for clients. And then as we, do some collaboration, some, verbal dialogue about what we're going to be doing, we shift over left. And then we ask them to put their hands in the sand, which goes back right. And then we might say, and what do you notice? And then they get to narrate it all before they've ever started collecting figures to arrange them into what we would call a world. So there's, between the sensation and the words and the imagery and the words, we just bounce back and forth. But there's this interesting thing too about the nature of language that's used in Sandtray and even in EMDR, if you think about it, that we often, the language we end up highlighting is very poetic. It's sensory rich, it's condensed, it's metaphor heavy. I don't think it's any coincidence that there's so much right hemisphere poetic language that shows up in both Sandtray and EMDR. Sandtray, that would go back again for, so many civilizations were playing in that. But if you think about our EMDR history, Francine Shapiro was, pursuing her PhD in literature before she ever went into psychology. And particularly, she was studying the poetry of Thomas Hardy. So as a poetry nerd, I like to imagine that she knew what she was doing by bringing so much of the language we use when you read back target information to a client that they've given you. It sounds like a poem. It is a very poetic reading. So even in Sandtray and in EMDR, our use of language isn't necessarily exclusive to the left hemisphere, because poetic language is a little bit more right hemisphere. It kind of lives right on that edge of processing between the two hemispheres.
Yeah, and I heard some wonderful things about so you're teaching I forget exactly what the workshop is, but like how to integrate poetry into psychotherapy, right?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. Once you get people unafraid of poetry, it can really bring a lot of powerful energy to it. I've interestingly noticed that other places in the world, they're far less phobic of poetry than we are in the US.
Why do you think it is? Why do you think we're so afraid of poetry?
Oh, I assume it has something to do with English teacher trauma for most people.
I could see that. Yeah, you didn't put the period in the right. You started the sentence with a but or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah. And our culture in the US is really devaluing of exploration. It's very linear, it's solve a problem, it's be direct, whereas a lot of cultures have held on to the belief that indirect can be more powerful. That allowing yourself to sit in ambiguity and uncertainty and metaphor, that's where healing is. We struggle with that a little bit more in our culture.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna take this last sentence you just said and print it and put it like big thing on my wall about exploration, because we are afraid of it. And yeah, we always have to be right about everything first time. And if it doesn't happen first time, then we're struggling. So I have to ask you a question, and then I want to hear more about the integration of Sandtray and EMDR. How many of these figures do you? I know you said it's a training center, but how many of these figures do you have in your training center office?
I have no idea. My attention span has never supported me in
Counting.
completing a count. I've started a few times, but then I start fidgeting with them, and then I would say probably a couple thousand here. In a more traditional office, there might be, a few hundred.
Yeah.
But even that is a little deceiving in the way it sounds, because you might have a bowl of colored stones, or a container of 20 soldiers, and so the numbers add up relatively quickly. So it's
Yeah.
really, in Sandtray, it's believed that it's not about the number, it's about variety. It's about
Yeah.
having choice and different kinds of expression. But
Yeah.
here, when people come to take workshops with me, there might be 15 or 20 people all needing to select figures at the same time. And so there's a little bit of an overabundance in
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
in this facility.
That sounds very fun. So, can you talk a little more in detail about that integration of EMDR and Sandtray? Maybe a little bit of what you're teaching and your training. So, if someone were to take your training, your webinar, what are they going to learn? What kind of tools are they going to be equipped with?
Mhm. Oh, well, that one of the convictions I have, Rodham, is we say in AIP thought that clients already have a blueprint to healing living inside their nervous system, and they just deserve to have someone believing that about them. And that's what
Mhm.
EMDR is meant to do, is unearth what has always been true for this person. Sadly, I don't think we do as good of a job making sure EMDR therapists also believe that about themselves. And so for me, learning EMDR isn't as much about memorizing formulas as it is remembering something that's already been locked away inside of your own nervous system, and starting to find your own expression of it. While we have to know EMDR well enough to make sure we're accurately following what makes EMDR EMDR, when you start moving into integrating it with a creative art approach, naturally a little fluidity has to show up in all of that. So when I teach in integration, I start with making sure we really understand the broad strokes of EMDR, not getting as hooked by trying to follow scripts, because those Sandtray figures aren't necessarily going to care that you have a script. That's not really how they work.
Right.
And also, you don't, if you really believe that the client has access to, you know, EMDR type healing already living inside of their body and mind, if you start processing worlds, you're going to notice clients will naturally move through phases on their own. So it's definitely not wrong to be more of a directive EMDR and SAND therapist. Not necessarily my style, because I find when I just allow clients to work in the sand, the first few sessions, they're giving me history. And then they move into needing to establish safety. And then those targets will start to come in the sand naturally. Sometimes they're being literal and they're telling me this corresponds to a memory. Other times it stays metaphorical, and you can feel you're inside an embodied connection to memory network, but I may not necessarily know exactly what explicit memory, even if they do, that they're working on. So there's a lot of trust, and I do think there's more of a pressure on expressive therapists who practice EMDR to know the fidelity of the model, because you're having to follow it without reading from anything. You're not going to be having all the cues in front of you. So you have a responsibility to really understand, the structure of it.
Yeah.
But it EMDR is still EMDR, even if it came from the client and the therapist didn't have to prompt it. And that has been an unexpected hurdle in teaching people to therapists to be empowered, in this
Yeah.
integration is if it shows up, if they spontaneously create a safe place and you never prompted it, go a safe place. You know where to step in and to ask the questions, to highlight sensation, to get emotion, know where to bring in the bilateral, because it's going to happen. It's not a matter of, oh, it might, it will, it's going to happen. And it's really powerful when it organically comes from the mind of the client instead of prompted by the therapist.
That sounds amazing. So yeah, I didn't even think about the resourcing. So phase two, so clients can create all kinds of resources.
Oh yeah, and we have kind of like cheat codes in Sandtray, because once they, let's say, safe place, comfortable place, whatever nomenclature you use, once you have that world that you have tapped into the client, not just getting a cue phrase, they can then shrink it to a cue figure. One of these miniatures become a representation of that moment. So whenever we get into processing later and reprocessing, if they end up stuck, blocked, looping, we can bring that figure from, earlier safe place work into view. And so our interweaves get to be more concrete. They get to be a little bit more literal. So it does feel sometimes like I'm waiting for the rest of the EMDR world to realize that in some ways, it's a lot more easy to do that work, because it's always right in front of you. You're not having to try and hold abstract things in your mind the way that you do in talk EMDR, because we have the support of concrete structures. And especially, my world has always been a little bit more about attachment wounding. I think we forget how difficult it is for people who are especially processing targets with some attachment insecurity alive in their body. It is really hard to have the level of reflective functioning to hold two competing ideas together. That's really a feature of secure attachment. And so to have this concrete manifestation of something, so they're not having to rely on an abstract ability, is very supportive of the client's process.
I'm curious, Marshall, you said that the webinar on January 12th, it's going to be a webinar, so you're going to teach it virtually. How do you teach it virtually, and how do people practice? Is there an option to practice Sandtray we have a lot of therapists in our community who only work virtually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely options. So this webinar, normally when I teach Sandtray and EMDR, it's a 2 or 3 day experience. This one is going to be more introductory. It's just a 3-hour introduction. And so I'm not even going to ask people to gather figures at their homes and offices. We're going to use a website. There's a free Sandtray virtual website that's kind of like little stickers you move into a picture of sand on the screen. But there are also virtual applications that are incredibly high tech. That one that's called Virtual Sandtray that you use on an iPad, and people can bury figures, put them up on the ledge of a tray. It looks like any of our other kind of beautiful video game interfaces. So there are ways to do it virtually like that, or you can, I have had clients where I have pictures of all of my shelves, and I created a PowerPoint deck that I would send to clients that they see my images, my miniatures, and I have a second camera that can look down into a Sandtray. So when I sign into Zoom, they see me on, one camera, and they see my Sandtray on the other, and they can tell me which figures to choose off of which shelves and tell me how to arrange it in the tray for them. And any one of those approaches, you lose a little bit of something, compared to the in the room experience of doing Sandtray. But you have to remember that clients don't necessarily know to compare those experiences, and even if they do, something is better than nothing. Like any version of work And I hate that the world woke up to virtual therapy because of, the situation that we all went through in
Yeah.
2020. But as a reality, as I have a disability, and so I've often in my career had to move to virtual work just out of my own safety. And it is exciting to me that clients with disabilities and medical needs, the rural poor, all kinds of manner of people are getting to benefit from work that, previously we didn't have the forethought to put as many resources into supporting those populations.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. I think before the pandemic, I'm guilty myself of thinking that I would never, I never thought that I would do so much virtual therapy. And I spend my time, probably half of my time in person with my clients and half doing virtual work. But yeah, things changed, and we have with the combination of technology, right? Because someone probably came up with this virtual Sandtray, which, by the way, people are asking for what's the tool that you recommend, if you remember on top of your head, and if not, we'll find it later.
Yeah, if you Google free online Sandtray, that's the one that is, very low level, but is free. It looks more like a child's, application. And then there's one called Simply Sandtray that you can purchase. And then the other app is called Virtual Sandtray, which is created by Jessica Stone and is very beautiful. I mean, it is stunning to look at. I am floored by how detailed that one has become.
Yeah. I'm wondering about kids versus adults. I think that traditionally a lot of people who don't know about Sandtray think about Sandtray as a treatment for children, but I think that it's as effective and as widely used as treatment for adults as well, right?
It is, yeah. Originally, when Lowenfeld was starting to explore its utilization, it wasn't called Sandtray because the first version of it didn't have sand involved. It was just figures. Her technique was called the world technique, which is why we still talk about build a world, create a world. It all goes back to that original version of the approach. But she was thinking primarily for children, and that would have been in the 1920s through the 1940s. But then she very quickly started realizing its utility with adults. And I would say it's still often misunderstood as a child technique. But the reality is you have to have some level of ability to move between concrete and abstract thought to get the most out of Sandtray. It's absolutely fine for it to be a version of play therapy with younger kids where they're playing with the figures inside the sand. But traditional Sandtray therapy, in the way that it's taught, usually starts to be most appropriate for older kids through adults. So I primarily, especially these days, I don't do a lot of traditional work. I only do EMDR intensives, and I'm only seeing adults. And yet, poetry, sand, and clay are the three modalities I work in with adults.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Marshall, if you can talk a little bit more about that integration with EMDR. So what does that look like? Someone in the chat asked if there are videos that show that integration of EMDR and Sandtray. I'm wondering if, you can talk maybe a little bit about the reprocessing phases and what does that look like?
Sure. I have seen some videos on YouTube. I've seen some people talk about it and show some examples. Of course, Ana Gomez, if you do her long training, she has some videos. If you do a longer training with me, I show some video. A lot of us I know are kind of protective over our clients' stories, and so they tend to be mock videos of it. As far as what it looks like, I do a version of all the phases in the Sandtray. And so history taking, is open-ended at first, create a world, because I'm not just trying to get to know the concrete details of their history. I'm also trying to get a sense of how they make meaning, where they find safety, where they have, how much resource do they have. I also teach a workshop on understanding a client's relationship with dissociation through how they do Sandtray. And so in that early history taking phases, I feel like I'm getting a lot of that data just by getting to watch how they interact with metaphor. It's very revealing, as well as, you can do timelines in the sand. You can do, genograms in the sand, all of those kind of potential phase one approaches. When you move on to phase two, if the client already has a lot of internal resources, it might be as simple as doing comfortable place. But, again, with my population primarily being people with complex trauma and dissociation who come from attachment wounded backgrounds, I spend a lot of time in phase two in the Sandtray, and there are all the versions of kind of Laurel Parnell words that you can bring into that. Deb Wesselman and Ann Potters. If you think of any of those wordings that those great innovators have brought us, they will naturally often show up in the processing of a world in the phase two. And then when you start moving into phase three and beyond, it becomes pulling something from their timeline and then them building a world about it if they're not naturally doing it on their own. If as the target resolves and you move on to, working with a positive cognition, for me, it's just taking that original figure that started the world into a new world where they get surrounded with that new belief, and they get to still have the visual of, this wounded world over here. And now they get to see it held with this new emerging world. And then you might also be able to see, oh, this is hard for me right here. Like I have some Sandtrays that are human shaped. So that's where we would then do the body scan, as you scan your body, place anything, or they may even just draw with their fingers what they're feeling in their body and draw it in the sand. So it's every single phase has, a place in Sandtray.
Yeah. I'm wondering about phase four, if you can kind of provide a little more, like maybe an example, maybe a case example of what phase four looks like, that when you integrate it with Sandtray, it works better than when you do your traditional EMDR.
Yeah. So, there was an adult male I was seeing who, had created a world about when he was a very young child, his mother died. And so it was about how the news was delivered to him. Because it was not a situation that was expected. So it was, a surprise that he got at the end of a school day coming home and being on his front yard, there being a scene happening and someone coming out and giving him the news in a very insensitive way. I had been seeing him for many months, and he had tried to verbally tell me that story a couple of times, and he couldn't get through it. He would become too dysregulated, which, by the way, everyone should know. I'm not afraid of dysregulation, and I have non-traditional views on that, but we can get to that another time. But what he was able to do, I didn't even prompt him at this point to build the world, but he was building a world about some animals, just as an opening. We were doing an intensive, and as he was building this world about animals, it became very apparent that he was building a grief tree. And then he started realizing, this feels like the day that I learned I lost my mom. And so he was able to go back and reference that. And then I said, would you like to talk about that target in terms of your mom, or would you like to talk about it in terms of these animals? And he needed more distance. And so we then talked about the animals, and I was able to say, when you look at this little puppy, what do you notice? And what's he believe about himself in light of what's happening? And he answered the questions, for his 4-year-old self. There's no doubt that that's what he was doing, but he was able to hang with the dialogue a little bit more. after that target was set up in phase 3 and we started moving into the phase 4 work, it's as simple as, in talk therapy would say, now tell me what you notice. And in Sandtray, you get to say, tell me or show me. So they could then be moving the figures, bringing in things, covering things up, taking things out of the tray, in addition to the option of verbal disclosure as they move through. And it's the same as in talk. You're following those channels. You're watching that happen. The thing that I appreciate about Sandtray is, he was an older gentleman. And when he would get into those 4-year-old parts of self, he would sometimes lose access to speech. And I think a lot of times in EMDR, we think that that's only dissociation, and it can be, but it also could just be that they are changing developmental stage, as they're processing a channel. And when you're doing something like Sandtray, it's appropriate for all ages. And so in one moment, he might be speaking about a channel and looking at this world and talking from a very adult perspective, but the next moment, like even the way that he would grip the figures would be childlike, and he was able to keep moving them around. And so we didn't experience an interruption in processing. He was able to let whatever emerging part of self that came forward continue to do the work. And we did that until, the disturbance had moved to a point it made sense to check in and see if it had cleared.
That sounds amazing, Marshall. So I want to say again, thank you so much, Marshall Lyles, for your time and your wisdom and for sharing it with us.